Good morning, everyone. We've had an amazing response to this event, so I'm really pleased. You're obviously all super keen to up your SEO games in 2021. I'm Lisa, and so I'm responsible for heading up our events at Torchbox, so I'm always really keen to hear any feedback that you have or any suggestions for future topics. And I'm delighted to introduce your speakers for today. We have Nick Vines, who is one of our SEO analysts, and he also made his debut at Brighton SEO last week. And Nick has been managing SEO for projects including Great Ormond Street Hospital and Islamic Relief UK and NHS Digital. And Nick is your host for today, and so he's going to be sharing tips on keeping up to date with the latest trends and how you can understand exactly what search engines are looking for. And he's also joined by his partner in crime, Jenny. And Jenny is our SEO consultant, and she'll be leading our next session on the 28th of April, where she'll be telling you how to put everything that you've learned today into practice. So there was too much to get through in just one event, so we are splitting it across the two. Jenny manages accounts for clients such as Oxfam and Greenpeace and Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital Charity. And today she's not hosting, but she is on hand to answer any questions that you have. And we're also joined by Phil, who is our Director of Digital Marketing, who many of you are already familiar with. And Phil is also on hand to answer questions. So we do want it to be interactive. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our speakers, if you can use the Q&A facility, that's really handy because it helps us to keep track of them, but also pop them in the chat if you prefer. We might try and answer some of them during the session, but we have got some time at the end available as well, so we can answer them then. And for any that we don't get to, I will send all of the answers in a follow-up email for you. So we've got 60 minutes, so we're due to end at 12, if not before. And we are recording the session today as well, and I think that's about it. So I will hand over to Nick now to get things going.
Cool. Thanks, Lisa. So welcome, everyone. Thank you all for turning up and coming to hear what we have to say today. So I just want to start with a little bit about who Torchbox are. So for those of you who don't know, Torchbox is the leading digital agency in the nonprofit space. So as you can see, we work with some really incredible charities, and we provide SEO services to the NHS and digital marketing services to a whole load more. We also build sites and have recently launched the new Oxfam site, as well as the new NASA site, which was a really, really cool site to build. We launched it just in time for the new Mars Perseverance lander, and really incredible client to work with from a process perspective as well. Great. So let's just cover a little bit about why you're here today. So I'm going to assume that most of you want to know what Google wants to rank you up here at the top. Well, I'm sure that you're aware, but for those that aren't, Google uses an algorithm to basically calculate which search results are the most relevant for that search that has been made in that moment. So it's essentially a massive equation that's used to figure out, to basically search the library of the internet that Google keeps and figure out which search results are the most relevant for the search that you've made. There's so much content out there that Google basically has to use this process to basically figure out what is the most relevant. But what about other search engines? Well, according to Statistica, who ran a study last year, over 85% of users are using Google as their primary search engine. So the next three search engines are Bing, Yahoo, and DuckDuckGo, and together they command about 13% of the overall market share. So it's not even close. Google is the most sophisticated search engine by far, and that's why we choose to basically primarily optimize for Google, because what we find is what works for Google works for other search engines as well. So before we get into what Google wants in 2021, we're just going to dive into a little bit more theory about why it wants these things. So first, we need to understand the algorithm, so what it's trying to achieve and how it does it. So some of you might have been working in SEO for long enough to know that there are all sorts of algorithms, updates that were named after all sorts of crazy different things that basically covered all sorts of different facets of SEO and sites. So you'd have things like Panda, which would cover the quality, or you'd have something named Penguin, which basically covered link quality. They all have these funny names, and they basically operate alongside the main core algorithm, which kind of sits in the center of it all. So periodically, Google would make significant changes to each of these algorithms, and it would change the face of the search engine results page. And SEOs across the globe would basically just lose their minds. But that's not quite how it works anymore. So it's a bit of a different story today. And actually, all of these kind of supplementary algorithms have been rolled into the main core algorithm. So instead of being, it's tweaked daily. So there's constantly little adjustments that are being made. But they still do periodic updates, but they're a lot less turbulent than they used to be, mainly because the search results are so relevant now already that there's not that much difference in it when they do these big updates. So let's just take a real quick look at how this looks in real time. So this is a timeline of when a searcher basically enters a search and presses enter. So on the left, you can see where they've entered the search. And then what happens is the algorithm basically interprets what the user is asking for. It then searches the index, which is essentially a library of the entire internet that Google keeps. So it searches that for the most appropriate results. And then it orders those results in the most appropriate order. So basically trying to understand what will answer your query best and putting that at the top and then working top down. So then the search engine results page is returned and then the user clicks on what they deem to find most important. And all of this happens in a fraction of a second. So before we get into what search engines want, let's just talk about what they don't want. So search engines don't want websites to try and game the algorithm in order to benefit from higher rankings. This would lead to a poor user experience for their users because maybe content that is not relevant to the search will rank highly. So in the past, SEOs have used all sorts of crazy techniques to basically try and game the algorithm and achieve these higher rankings. Thankfully, what we find now is that these techniques no longer work because Google has engineered their algorithm to prevent that from happening. If you do try and use these techniques these days, it can actually end up harming your rankings or even giving you a penalty and excluding you from the rankings entirely. So it's just not even worth going there. So let's look at what search engines do want. So search engines want to provide the most relevant content available to resolve searchers' queries in the most helpful format possible. So it's a little bit of a mouthful. But what we've done is we've summarized basically Google's huge documentation about their approach to search in this one sentence. So that's why. But one thing I want to highlight here is the emphasis on the searcher. So Google is placing the searcher at the heart of everything. So there was once a time when SEO would be a bit more about box ticking, and you'd get recommendations like, make sure you have X amount of links to this page, or make sure you put your primary keyword followed by your secondary keyword in your page title. Well, it's quite different now. And some of these principles still guide SEO best practice today, but the actual practice of SEO has changed significantly since then, and for the better. We're putting the user at the heart of everything instead of trying to optimize for search engines and crawlers. So now we understand what Google values and why, we can explore what Google wants in 2021. So like Lisa covered already, there's so much to cover when it comes to keeping up to date with search, which is why we've had to split this up into 2 webinars. So today's session is going to basically lay the groundwork for our next webinar, which is going to be hosted by Jenny, and it's titled Demystifying Rankings, What Do You Actually Need to Rank Highly? But for today, we're going to get into what Google wants in 2021. So the first thing I want to talk about is how Google wants sites to maintain a high quality page experience. And the most significant thing to happen in 2021, without a doubt, is Core Web Vitals. So everybody is talking about Core Web Vitals, but what does it actually mean? So it comprises of 3 elements. So the first one is how fast your page loads. The second one is how quickly your page can be interacted with. And the third one is how visually stable your pages are. So this year in May, they're going to be rolled into the core algorithm. And we're just going to very quickly cover what these 3 things mean. So the first one is pretty obvious. So SEOs have been going on about page speed for years now. And I'm sure that if you've been working with an SEO at any point, then they will have bitten your ear off about page speed and making sure that your pages are loading fast. So Google has been placing a lot more focus on this in recent years, but now they're rolling it into the main core algorithm as a page quality indicator. And this graph basically shows us why. So software provider Kissmetrics conducted a study and found that abandonment rate increases significantly as your page load time increases. So as it says at the top of this slide, halving your load speed could halve your page's abandonment rate. Sorry. So most fast pages load under 2 seconds. So it's pretty eye-opening to see that if your page load speed increases to 4, so doubles in load speed, you're going to double your abandonment rate. So one thing that we noticed with this study is that it's quite e-commerce heavy, but still, the takeaways are still applicable to the nonprofit sector. So if your page is loading 3 seconds faster, it could increase your abandonment rate by up to 20%. So that's page speed. Next, we're going to cover what interactivity is. So we've all had this experience where you've landed on a page, you've clicked the button, and then nothing happens. So at this point, you either wait or you bounce back to the search results. Either way, it's pretty safe to say that you're going to be quite frustrated at your experience of that page. So this is bad for user experience, and if your site is guilty of this, then you could be harming your rankings. And the final aspect of Core Web Vitals is visual stability. So again, I'm sure we've all had this experience at some point in our lives where you go to click on something and then something above the page loads in the exact second that you're about to click on it and then pushes the button down and then you click on something else. So it's hugely frustrating. And this is why Google has included this as part of these page quality indicators. Great. So having gone through all of these, I think it's pretty safe to assume that that it's pretty important to make sure that your pages have a positive page experience. And this is why. So these 3 factors are being rolled into the Google's search signals for page experience. And this is a really big deal. So let's take a look at what they're equating it to. Google is putting it up there with such basic site necessities as mobile friendliness or having your site on a safe, secure server. And in May 2021, these signals are going to be basically rolled into the main algorithm alongside all of these other indicators. So Jenny's going to cover a bit more in detail in her webinar about how you can optimize your site for these things. But next, I'm just going to take a quick look at mobile friendliness because there's another really big update that's happening this month that you should probably know about. So by now, every site on the internet should be fully responsive. That should just be a given. And as we've covered, this is something that's being prioritized by Google when it comes to rankings. But this year, Google has changed the way that they're crawling sites. So as of this month, when Google visits your site, they're only going to look at your mobile version. So they're going to completely ignore your desktop version. And this is something that's been confirmed by Google. So Google has been prioritizing mobile for years, and they've been slowly moving towards a mobile first index. And what that means is they're crawling your mobile site first and then your desktop site. But as of this month, basically Google is only going to visit your mobile site. So you need to make sure that your site is fully responsive and showing exactly the same things on desktop as it is on mobile. Otherwise, your rankings could see some damage. And so one thing to bear in mind is that if you're going through a new site, make sure that you build your site mobile first in the future and then focus on the desktop side of things. Great. So we've covered what Google wants from your site in 2021. But now, if you think back to their mission that we covered earlier, they said that they wanted to provide the most relevant content in the most helpful format possible. So next, we're going to take a look at what that looks like. So I'm sure everyone's aware of featured snippets. They've been around for a number of years now. But for those who don't, they're basically a quick answer box that appear at the top of the search results. They typically will answer questions that you ask or just provide a very quick snippet of information around the search that you've just made. So one of our tool providers, Ahrefs, did a study recently and found that 12% of searches are now triggering a featured snippet. But featured snippets aren't the only enhanced search listing that are out there. A staggering 70% of searches are now listing some sort of enhanced search listing, and Google's getting more creative with them and becoming more helpful. So here on the left, you can see something that was released last year. So these are called health cards. And essentially, if you search for any sort of a condition, medical condition, it will appear with the overview of what it is, your symptoms and your treatments. This has been a project that was linked up with the NHS, and so it's all verified and it's legitimate information. Other things as well are things like this COVID dashboard on the right. So it gives you all sorts of graphs and tables and maps and news articles that are related to COVID. So remember the goal, most helpful format possible. And this is exactly what Google's trying to do.
Just saying, Nick, I think this is a really interesting area of SEO. And I kind of was just triggered a memory there of a conversation that we had with the NHS about this, because I would imagine there's quite a few non-profits here today thinking, like, who have been sort of maybe not kept awake at night by this, but certainly thinking this is, particularly on the meningitis one there on the left, this could have quite a big impact in the healthcare space. Getting a quick answer it might lead to a zero click. I mean, I'm skeptical about it because, I can't think of the last time, apart from what time is it, where I Googled something and I've then just not gone on to a website and I've gone, oh, thank you, Google, you're such an excellent source of knowledge. But it is something we need to be mindful of, I think, here. And the conversation we had with the NHS here, who have been in a lot of talks about this, is, I mean, they're slightly different, but their perspective here is that it doesn't really matter in the healthcare space if a user is getting the NHS's information. And in the NHS's case, it's quite unique because they've partnered with Google on this. If they're getting the information, it kind of doesn't matter if they get onto the website. Now, that's going to create some conflicts for some nonprofits, right, who might think about donations and the impact that has on that. But I just think this is a really interesting one to watch, and it still feels like it hasn't fully played out yet. And given that the NHS test and trace thing there, that's a new one we've seen recently, right? That's a new kind of where they pick out key moments in the YouTube video.
Yeah, exactly. So to expand on that point is essentially Google is not going to stop doing this. This is, they're going to keep trying to find new ways to make content freely available in helpful formats. And something that you touched on there, Phil, is what I'm going to move on to next as well, which is the concept of zero-click SERPs. So 2/3 of searches now do not result in a click. So what this means is for nonprofits so for nonprofits, what this can mean is that maybe some of your awareness content might not be clicked on as much. So we saw the example of the health cards. We have a client who is a disease awareness charity, and they've seen a fairly notable decrease in sessions to their awareness content. So this is something to bear in mind when it comes to looking at reporting and things like this. But also, you can question what the goal is. So is your goal, your primary goal on your site, to drive traffic? Or is your primary goal to just make users aware of what your cause is and, make sure that they're finding relevant information? So, like I said, these search listings are great for Google, but they might cause some problems for your nonprofit and for your reporting. So it's just something to bear in mind. Also, just one other thing to add with this is that the owner of SparkToro, who did this study, is someone called Rand Fishkin. And he's actually very well known in the industry for just loving a headline and just like, he's got a very big, he's one of the original SEO influencers, and he's got a big following, and he just loves throwing big headlines out there. And so, yeah, so we do take this with a pinch of salt because, as Phil said, people do still click on things. So to cover, so the next point in terms of providing information in the most helpful format possible is something called Searchless Search. So how do you think that works? Well, in 2018, Google introduced something called Google Discover, and it can be found on Android in the Google app and also on iPhone as well. So it's a mobile platform, and it's a feed that basically contains news and articles and evergreen content and anything that Google thinks is relevant to the user. So what Google's trying to do here is trying to replicate maybe a social media feed. So it's surfacing articles that it thinks you would like from the internet based on your search history and your browser history. So again, what they're doing here is they're putting the user at the center. What could be better than just going onto your phone and finding content that you didn't even know you needed, and then it just being there and you can click on it and engage with it. So it's something that's quite hard to optimize for, but what we find is the typical SEO concepts apply. So create evergreen content, list talk about the latest industry trends to do with your sector, news that is relevant to your sector as well, and informative kind of opinion pieces. So for a nonprofit, this basically means just keep doing what you're doing, and this content will surface. So one example of where this has worked really well for one of our clients is a marine conservation charity. So MPAs, so marine protected areas, have been pretty big in the news recently with all of these super trawlers and whatnot. And so the conversation in the public was very much around MPAs. And what they found is when there was a spike in searches about MPAs due to kind of what was going on in the public, this marine conservation charity saw a massive uplift in sessions. So they saw a 2K increase in sessions over 2 days, just because they were featured in the Google Discover interface.
Nick, I think this is really like when we went through this yesterday and I saw this, I have to say I was pretty spooked by this, because I use an Apple and I've never had an Android device. So there's probably some people on here who might never have seen this. And my initial thought was, tell me this isn't the Google result, like the main google.co.uk site, because if they're moving into sort of socially or curated feeds, that was going to be the sort of the next step in the sort of tech wars. But yeah, it would be. I'm interested to see if they're doing this in something like Google Discover and it gets some traction, which I guess it already has some traction. But if it indicates, you know, a future for Google where they do move into this curated world, would be quite an interesting step for them.
Yeah, it would definitely be an interesting step. But the thing is that this all revolves on the internet. So it doesn't exist without the internet in the first place, with people creating this content. So it's and also the other thing to add about Google Discover is that, you know, looking at what you can see in this screenshot here, you know, all you can see is just a snippet. So it's essentially the same as a search listing. So it's not going to be resulting in 0 clicks nearly as much as, say, an enhanced search listing. Great. So so now we've covered two things so far. We've covered what Google wants from your site and what Google wants in terms of helping its users. So this is the final one that we're going to cover. So the next thing we want to cover is how Google wants to reduce their reliance on keywords and links to determine rankings. So the reason Google wants to do this is because despite their best efforts, people are still trying to manipulate the rankings using keywords and links. It's natural, you know, you want to manipulate the algorithm so that you can rank highly and sell more things or have more traffic. So creating a mechanism that allows them to do this allows them to provide a better user experience for their users, i.e. surfacing the most relevant content that they need. And so the first thing we're going to cover is this concept of entities. So this is essentially getting Google to understand you as an organization. So I like to think of these entities as digital models of the real world. And this is a quote direct from Google about what they see an entity as. An entity is a thing or concept that is singular, unique, well-defined, and distinguishable. So to me, in fewer words, this basically means that an entity is anything notable enough for users to search it by name, which I would expect all of your organizations to be. But outside of the nonprofit zone, this could be a place, it could be a person, it could be an organization, or an item, or an idea, or a concept. So how do you check if you're an entity? All you have to do is Google yourself. So here we've Googled Rand Fishkin. So I mentioned him earlier. He's one of the original SEO influencers. And you see here that Rand has what's called a knowledge graph. So having a knowledge graph essentially means that Google sees you as an entity. So how to check if you're an entity? All you have to do is Google yourself. And I'm sure Rand does this all the time. All nonprofits should have a knowledge graph, but we're just going to explore a little bit how these work together. So trying to piece together how these work might seem complicated, but essentially building and mapping these entities helps Google get a deeper understanding of searchable things and concepts. Therefore, by understanding the internet better, it lowers their reliance on links and content. So let's just explore this example here. So I've kind of done a very rudimentary breakdown of what entities within the nonprofit space can look like. So if you look at the bottom right of the screen, you'll see the concept, the entity of nonprofit, which can then be split up into three other separate entities. We have charity, NGO, and government organization. So if we go down the charity track, you can see, okay, so Oxfam, another entity, founded in 1942, another entity. founded by Cecil Jackson Cole, a person, so another entity, and based in Oxford, England, which is, if you go up, a city, another entity. And again, so if you go upwards from the non-profit zone, you can see you've got government organisations, so the NHS, focused on public health, linked to World Health Organization, who, if you go down, is an NGO. So hopefully this can kind of show you how Google links all of these entities together. And this means that instead of looking at words on a page or the number of links that your content has, they can basically look wider and have a deeper understanding of the internet. So how does Google use these entities? So we're definitely seeing these entities in use in the knowledge graph, and also as part of these kind of search suggestions at the bottom, so people also search for. We're also seeing it being in use in Google Discover. So we're in our very early stages of understanding how this entity technology works, but could it be being used for page rankings? Well, this hasn't been communicated directly by Google, and I imagine that if it is, then they probably won't be announcing this. But my guess is that they probably are. Right? And if they're not, then it's a case of if not now, then when. So Jenny's going to cover in a little bit more detail about how you can work on your entity and build it and make sure that you have a strong entity in the eyes of Google. But next, we're going to cover something called EAT. So EAT stands for expertise, authority, and trust. And Google has name-checked this framework as a way of measuring trust in the content. So until recently, your trustworthiness and your authority of your content was handled solely by links. So looking at how many links you have, how many high-quality links you have as well. But as I kind of talked about already, this can be easily manipulated. You know, people can buy links or people can start up all sorts of linking networks. And so Google really wants to move away from using links as the main indicator of trust. So, and EAT is how they're doing it. And this is something that's been flagged as especially important for medical, legal, or financial sites. The reason why is because these have drastic consequences on people's lives. So they need to make sure that the right information is being surfaced. Otherwise, it could have a spiraling effect on someone's life. So let's just talk about, let's talk a little bit about what expertise means. So expertise refers to the creator of the content. So are they an expert on that content? Do they have the credentials to back that up? And is it available to find on your website? So it's safe to say that we would take our COVID advice from someone like Dr. Chris Whitty, the NHS's chief medical officer, and we'd try and avoid taking it from someone like Dr. Nick from The Simpsons. So, so you need to make sure that if you're creating content that could impact someone's life, you need to be able to back it up and make sure that your author is an expert. Right, so the next one is authority and trust. So these two are very closely linked, and it comes naturally to most sites. So it's more aimed at the more spammy side of the internet, where people are kind of doing whatever they can to try and get their sites ranking higher. But just to explore this in a bit more detail, authoritativeness refers to having a recognized authority in your industry. So users know who you are, they know that you're a trustworthy source of information. Trustworthy basically means that people can trust you to provide honest and accurate information that is true. So like I said, pretty much all of your sites and nonprofits will already kind of naturally fall under this category because it's more aimed at the spammy side of the internet. But there's always more that can be done in terms of building your expertise and your authority and your trust. And EAT is very important. So this is a quote from the Google Search Quality Guidelines. And this is basically this huge long document that Google uses as like a basis to basically understand whether the search results are high quality or not. So you can see here, as I've highlighted in yellow, you can see here, like they've highlighted in yellow, that it's very important. And let's remind ourselves of why this is. A better experience for their users. So basically making sure that relevant content is ranking up high.
Nick, before we just go on, I think that's like, I was unaware that there was that like, almost like a manual that, that Google have got in place. You sometimes see that like referenced as like, oh, Google have filed this patent for this thing. So we now know that they're doing this thing. But this is really interesting to think that although like we don't know a lot about SEO, or we know nothing, is always the first line that any sensible SEO would say. This is really interesting that there is actually quite explicit guidelines out there from Google about what they're after. I wonder where is this taken from? Sorry, and if you got a link we could share maybe in the chat or something.
Yeah, so we can definitely share a link to this for sure. So it's quite a funny story actually, because essentially Google loves to talk about AI and machine learning and all these things and how they're automating all their algorithms and stuff. But one thing that most people don't know about the search about the search results is that they're constantly being monitored by actual humans. So there's a whole team of people who basically will conduct searches and then look at the top 10 results and judge which are the most relevant results. So they're using their own knowledge, and this is where this documentation comes from. So this documentation basically is their Bible for what is a high quality search result. And so they basically know this whole long list of reasons off by heart, and then they'll basically be going through, making hundreds and thousands of searches, testing the algorithm, and basically feeding back into the algorithm when it's not right, so that then the AI and the machine learning can then start to take its place. Great. So that's it. So that's basically what we think Google wants in 2021. So there's so much to consider these days when it comes to SEO, and I literally could have gone on for another hour just covering it all. But what I've focused on here today is what I think is the most important things that you should know about in 2021, and try to summarize it into these 3 points. So to recap, we've got Google wants sites to maintain a high quality page experience. So this is using things like Core Web Vitals and mobile friendliness. It also wants to make content more easily available to its users, so with enhanced search listings. And it also wants to reduce their reliance on keywords and links to determine rankings. It will be doing this using entities as well as the EAT framework. So now I just want to cover a little bit about how I keep up to date with the latest trends in SEO. So SEO is an ever-changing game. There's always new things being released and tweaked and announced. And I'm just going to cover exactly how I make sure that I stay on top of it all. So the first source is direct from Google. So where better to learn about all the new technologies and all the new algorithm updates and whatnot from Google themselves. So this is the #1 source. But if you just look at this blog alone, then you could miss some very key pieces of information or insights. So Google's blog is called the Google Search Central blog, and you can just find it and just follow it and read it from time to time and keep up to date. But if I was to use an analogy of buying a car, then this would be like just reading the car manufacturer's website and then deciding to buy. So to build on this, you need to try and expand your horizons. And these are, to me, the 2 top sources of SEO information. So these are 2 widely recognized blogs, or actually they're not blogs, they're news publishers. And they provide top-level information about all the latest updates and dive a bit deeper than maybe Google would. They also provide all sorts of independent thinking and critical analysis of anything and everything to do with SEO. So it's a really good place for an interested reader. And again, to return to the car analogy, this would be kind of like reading the Which Guide, or maybe going to whatcar.com to get more of an objective view of that car. So the next thing, if you want to dive a bit deeper into SEO, is by going to these respected SEO blogs. So there are a number of respected SEO blogs out there. These are the ones that I think are probably the most important ones that you can follow. And they're typically owned by quite respected thought leaders and SEO influencers in the SEO space. So they'll often take a deeper dive than, say, the news publishers and Google will, and they'll provide an alternative take on what's going on. So they might conduct their own experiments and also provide their own hypotheses and conclusions as well. So it's really good for really expanding your view as to what's going on in SEO. So like I said, these are a selection of a few of our favorites here at Torchbox. One thing that you can do today is sign up to Mary Haynes's newsletter. It's really great, and it basically will summarize the SEO news from the week and email it to you on Monday every single week. Great. And then the final source of information is Twitter. So this is if you really want to keep your finger on the pulse. Twitter allows you to engage directly with the most knowledgeable SEOs, And I really like it because it gets an even wider perspective. So one person that you can follow is this guy, John Mueller. So the guy I've quoted on the top left. Sorry. And he's a really good person to follow because a lot of the conversations about SEO surround him. He's basically the search liaison for Google. So he's the mediator between SEOs and the tech heads at Google. And like I say, a lot of the conversations revolve around him. And so it's really good to get a deeper understanding of what's going on. So again, to return to the car analogy, this is like going to the pub and basically talking to someone who actually owns that car. And finally, one last thing I do is I use what's called an RSS feed aggregator. So what this does is it basically rolls up the news sources using their RSS feeds, which is basically kind of like an API that allows you to do things like this. And so I follow a whole load of blogs. So the ones we covered today, the Google blog, those news publishers, as well as a whole load of other people that I respect in the SEO industry. And what it does is it will roll all of their articles up into one feed, and it allows me to basically check it daily. So it's a bit of a ritual for me for the last 7 years to basically just check this every day when I log in. And it just allows me to just keep up to date with the latest trends and what's going on. Great. So I just want to say, again, thank you so much for coming today. I've really enjoyed putting this presentation together and speaking to you all. So I haven't actually been able to see the chat while I've been doing this. So I'm going to turn over to Lisa and Jenny to start harboring the questions and also plug in my charging cable.
Nick, I think you can stop sharing now as well, and we'll get Jenny and Phil.
Yeah, we've got some really interesting questions here. Some of them are quite chunky, so I suggest we just crack on with them and bring Jenny into the conversation as well. But I'm going to try, and some of these are a little bit kind of bunched up, so I'll try and bunch that. I wanted to just I'll do them in order of that they've been asked quite early on. Anne asked a question about featured snippets, and Anne's question was, is this something you can build? Can you build a featured snippet? Could you just run through quickly? Jenny, you might want to take this one to give Nick a chance to catch his breath. But is that something you can, what do you do? Is it Google Search Console? Do you build it? Just talk through the basics of featured snippets quickly for us.
Sure, will do. So featured snippets are, it's what you see at the top of a search engine like Google results page. It's typically in the form of a couple of sentences, but sometimes you might see, like in Nick's example, there was a bullet pointed list. Occasionally there's a table as well. And what that featured snippet is Google taking information from somewhere within your page and actually putting that, like pulling out that snippet and putting it at the top of the search results. So it's sometimes known as position 0 because it appears above all the other organic search results. And you can get them organically, as in you can be, it's Google selecting that text from your site. Like you don't have to do anything for that text to be pulled out and for you to display in the featured snippet spot. However, it is actually an SEO strategy in itself because you can make tweaks and changes and optimizations and write content on your site in order to try and gain that featured snippet. And I could talk about this for a long time. It's just to say I'm going to be covering this in the next webinar where we talk a little bit more about the tips and tricks for how to rank highly. But for featured snippets particularly, the idea is that you write snippetable content, so self-contained 1 to 2 sentences that answers the user's query exactly. So the key to doing it as a strategy is making sure you understand what your users are searching for and making sure that you answer that query in a succinct way and signpost it on your site. But I'll delve into a bit more detail in the next webinar as well.
Thanks, Jenny. There's a really interesting one here. It's quite a big one from Sam. Hi, Sam. And Simon has asked a similar question. And it's around EAT and around how, so I guess Simon's one encapsulates Sam as well, but how does Google measure, it's a big one, guys, how does Google measure whether your site is expert, authoritative and trustworthy? And I guess Sam's question is, and how do you kind of influence those things?
Shall I take that one to start, Nick? You can
why don't
chip
you start
in.
that one and then I can add anything else.
Cool. So that's a really good question. And I think so with like EAT, it is that has come from Google. That's Google's own language. That's not SEO's kind of trying to describe the thing that Google's doing. And it's Google's way of telling us and everybody that these are now kind of tenets that we should be focusing on. Each one, there's not like a specific checklist of you must do these things in order to be seen as more expert, authoritative and trustworthy. But as SEOs, we've done a lot of testing and worked out, essentially like created a checklist from that to say, actually, this is what Google wants and this is how you can be seen as more EAT. And some of those, for example, are so as Nick was saying, it's like moving away from the traditional reliance on backlinks. Like backlinks still are really important to show that you're authoritative, but things like getting links back to your site, but also being mentioned, having great reviews, having positive sentiment about you online. Expertise is probably the most like the easiest one to quantify, and that is about the information that you put out about yourself on your website and on other websites, but showing that you have experts talking about your content. It's not just no offense to all of us who started out as interns in copywriting, but it's not just that you've got somebody to write about something. You've actually consulted the subject experts in order to write about this, and you demonstrate that on your site through the use of author profiles and through having your contact information visible on there. Essentially, the idea of this is less about charitable organizations don't tend to be the sorts of organizations that try and hide a lot of stuff behind the scene. Really, this came out to combat like spammy health sites that were trying to kind of buy into that healthcare space and trick people into buying their products. However, there's still some elements of EAT that we think lots of websites could improve on. And that will have a positive impact on your rankings.
Yeah. And just to pick up on one thing that Jenny said there as well is just to touch on. So I know that I name checked EAT in this and put it under the section of trying to move away from using links as a ranking factor, but by no means are links going anywhere anytime soon. So it's I just want to highlight as well that it's important to still think about generating high quality backlinks to your site where possible from relevant sources. That's kind of the line that we always stick to when it comes to recommending backlink building. But yeah, it's not going anywhere fast. So I think it's still important to think about backlinks when you're considering SEO.
Great. Okay, the questions are coming in quite thick and fast, so I'm just going to keep going through them in the order they were asked. There was a question around from Cine around zero-click searches and the hub. Have you answered that one?
I'm literally just about to. I've got my answer prepped
in as we speak. Okay, so I'll just move on to Sarah's question. Cine, your question is being answered as we speak. Sarah's asked that this is a really interesting one actually around search history and the user. Is there a sense that rankings are already kind of tailored to the user in some way?
So it's a bit of a murky area. Like there's no real way to quantify it because every search is going to be unique. But one thing that has been more important recently is and has been like there was an update called RankBrain. And essentially, that's one of these supplementary algorithms that sat alongside the core algorithm and has now been integrated. But what RankBrain basically looked at is trying to introduce a bit more personalization to the search results page. So Google will always say that, Google has always been saying that user signals are not really factored into the algorithm. But if you learn a bit more about RankBrain, you can kind of see how that technology would be applied to this kind of this kind of question. So of whether search results are being personalized or not. So unfortunately, I don't have a firm answer for you on that one, but that's kind of my take on it, which hopefully will clear things up a bit.
I think it's, from what we've seen, I think it's like a typical SEO thing where it's like, you know, telling people, please don't Google yourself. You're going to see different things to what we see. And when we report on rankings, that's why we use third-party apps and tools to be able to try and gather the most like standardized data possible. And we always say, this is what our tools say. We will take this as what we see as the kind of average current figure. But you might see something differently. So even though the official Google answer is they don't personalize search results, I think we can see that people's journeys change. So if it's like you're Googling your own organization, you might see it more because it's being seen as more relevant to you because you're clicking on it and engaging it more. Or it might be that if you're searching for yourself to check something and then you never click on it, then maybe you'll start ranking a bit further down than you normally would. So yeah, I think there is an element of personalization. I think, like as Nick alluded to with Rank Brain, and just the way that Google kind of does a lot of user testing with its journey, then there will be small fluctuations that are due to personalization and testing, which then might lead to your rankings changing. It's a difficult one to report on, but that's why we kind of monitor rankings over time and take averages and so on and so forth, because it is quite a difficult thing to measure. I hope that also goes some way into answering your question.
I have an interesting anecdote as well, and I'm going to keep it very quick because I know that we're running out of time. But you know, last night, for example, I was searching for bikes, and Google knows that I am a male user. Like, it just must do, because I've been using Google since I was about 13. So but I was shown mixed gender bikes. I was shown female and male. So that's just something like I've just pulled out of my head from last night. Hopefully that might answer your question.
Great, thank you. We're just going to keep powering through these guys because they're still coming in. They're great questions here. AMP. There is a question about AMP. So accelerated mobile pages. Again, there was a sort of AMP-ageddon, wasn't there, a few years back, where AMP was a really big thing in the SEO space. If Google are crawling mobile websites only now, are AMPs, I'm going to add the word still, worth exploring, or is it better to focus on optimizing your existing mobile site?
I'm happy to take this one. So with AMP, I think what you should be in the nonprofit sector and also in wider SEO, I think you should really be focusing on just making sure that you have a really fast site in general. Like, I think if possible, you should be running page speed reports, finding out what things are slowing your sites down, and then actioning those. AMP is good for like super competitive environments. Like, I'm talking about like news publishers like the Telegraph or the Guardian, making sure that they have like the fastest site. But I think you would be better in our sector. I think you'd be better placed focusing on trying to make your mobile site really fast than trying to. AMP is more of a workaround. So it's, you know, yeah, that's my answer.
I concur.
All right, great. There's a really interesting question here. We kind of broadly touched on it earlier when I sort of interrupted you, Nick, around the health cards. And Laura's asked, she said she found this really interesting, but how can a healthcare charity take advantage of this? And specifically, Laura says that she understands correctly that Google have partnered with the NHS, and obviously, you know, in the States, I think it's WebMD who do or are one of the trusted sources. But, you know, what does that mean for other, you know, epilepsy or diabetes charities? Are Google looking to other relevant specialist healthcare charity sites in this, or not just charity sites, but healthcare sites in this way when they think about populating those healthcare card results?
Sorry, just so I understand it. So the question is essentially, will other non-NHS sites feature in health cards. Is that?
Yeah, I think broadly that's it. Or if those health card sites are specifically the domain of the NHS information, what are our options here?
Yeah, so sadly, from what we understand of the health cards, from engaging with them, it is just the NHS who are linked with these health cards. So in terms of like, if you're, for example, like the example we use is an epilepsy charity, it's in terms of that, I would say my best recommendation would be to try and steer your strategy in a slightly different direction. So essentially, try not to focus on appearing for signs and symptoms content. I mean, obviously that's a core part of your organization, and you should still be trying to rank for these things because you are authoritative and trustworthy and have expertise, the EAT, in that industry. But I would say that it would be better to try and focus on maybe other signs of your organization, like support, instead of trying so desperately to achieve high rankings for that content, because essentially, like, and I've kind of thought about this quite a lot, and in my head I see it that there's two types of users when it comes to this. There's users who are not going to click, and there are users who are. And so users who are not going to click, you're just not going to get a click from them. That's just not going to happen. But the users who are, they're the ones who might click on the NHS link, or they might scroll down a little bit more and they might click on epilepsy in this case. So, you know, it's still worth having content that covers this stuff, but I think try to change your mindset. I don't know if you do this, but try to change your mindset so that you're less focused on trying to drive clicks from that content and see what other aspects of your organization you can.
I would just like to add to that. I think I agree with Nick's strategy there, and I know that that's from first-hand experience, both working with the NHS and an organisation who was trying to compete in that space as well. So I think, yes, it's definitely something to bear in mind. I think anything where it's to do with Google features, for example, and it's made it more difficult for you to compete. That's something for you to say, like, okay, we're going to bear that in mind if there's like a traffic difference between this year and last year. But what you can do in order to remain competitive against other like similar organizations is you can work on your EAT. So to be seen as experts, authoritative and trustworthy. If possible, you can ask the NHS for a backlink. They do often link out to charities who are more expert in certain subject areas. And also, I think it's forced us to be a bit more creative and think outside the box when it comes to organic traffic. So we've been trying to find other ways to make up that traffic in other areas. And like through this presentation, through this webinar, you've seen, you know, we've started to think about Google Discover and other kind of channels and sources of traffic as well.
There was a good question, which I answered live in the Q&A around measuring, kind of specifically measuring what metrics to use on EAT. And my answer was, you know, that no, there isn't a set of metrics in Google Search Console, but the domain authority, the MOS metric, the sort of most famous metric of them all, is still a very good indicator. And the old, you know, focus on backlinks, link from The Guardian, is still really important. There's two more questions that we've just got 5 minutes I'd like to just get to. Jason has asked a question that I ticked as done and answered, but I just want to touch base because it's interesting relating to this. He asks if there is a balance to strike between Core Web Vitals and EAT, and he flags the BBC as a website that is clearly performing very badly from a Core Web Vitals perspective, but very well, obviously, from an EAT perspective. What are your thoughts on that?
I can start with that one just to quickly say that so imagine that as a website you have one piece of content and you're the only person with that piece of content. Then if somebody searches for it, you will rank highly because you are the only one that is relevant for it. So I think like relevance is the most important thing to rank highly. That's not in real life. In real life, you will have lots of other websites and pages trying to rank for similar terms or talking about similar things that will also appear highly. And that is where things like authority and EAT come to play. And that is like Google does really put a lot of emphasis on that for the big players like BBC, like gov.uk, sites like NHS. And that, yeah, I think technical SEO is important, and site speed is a big thing coming out this year. But I think it is, in terms of priority, you have content and relevancy first, then you have authority and EAT, and then third you would have technical SEO. Is how I would prioritize it. Is it gets you those gains, but it won't get you gains in terms of getting above sites like the BBC unless you have better content. Would that anything to add? Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I've got nothing to add.
All right, I've just answered the last question. I think that's pretty much it with 2 minutes to spare. So yeah, wow, look at that.
Yeah.
Well done.
Multitasking.
Just want to say thank you to Nick as well, because that was a huge amount of information to fit in, and you did it really well. And thank you for all your questions, and for everybody that stayed right until the end as well. We will be recording this, so I'll share it with you and share Nick's slides as well, because I know there was a huge amount to take in. And hopefully I've seen a few of you have now registered for the next event as well that weren't coming previously, so we'll look forward to seeing you all again on the 28th of April.
Great. And I just want to say thank you everyone again for coming today. Like I said, I really enjoyed putting this together, and I've really enjoyed speaking to you today. So yeah, hopefully see you all at the next one.
Thanks guys.
Bye.
Nice Easter holidays, everybody. See you later.